Hey everyone, welcome to the Naked Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Sage Hobbs, author and creator of Naked Communication, and I'm so psyched you're here. This show is all about taking charge of your life in new and inspired ways to create a life you deeply love. It's about being more you in all areas of your life, more courageous, more free, more alive, more naked. I'll be sharing stories and advice from amazing people around the world who are up to incredible things on how they are successfully breaking free from fear and old patterns in order to create incredible relationships and impactful lives so that you can do the same. This is the place to be inspired to live a courageous and naked life. Let's do this. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the next episode of Naked Conversations. I'm so excited you're here with us, as always. And today I have an incredible guest who I am deeply fascinated by, and I know you are going to be too. I have with us Joselin Linder, who is the author of The Family Gene and has an incredible story to share. Thanks for being here, Joselin.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited.
Yay. Okay, so look, I always start out with the same question for everyone. We're going to start there, but I'm so eager to dive into your story. But I want to start with a question that I ask everyone, which is, what does courage mean to you?
I think for me, I always have this idea that the anticipation of a thing is always scarier than the actualization of a thing. Mm-hmm. So I think, and even though that's a really hard thing to sort of think about, it's actually I feel like you have to experience it to actually know that that's true. But I feel like in every time that my worst fear has been realized, which sadly is more than once, mm-hmm. I've kind of started to be okay, so when the thing is actually happening, you just deal with the thing that's happening, instead of thinking when it actually happens to me, I'm going to fall apart or freak out or whatever, the sort of anticipation of that fear. So I think courage for me is the recognition that the actualization of any fear is actually, I don't know if I want to say easier, but it's different than what that fear was when you anticipated it.
Okay, I love that. It's funny you say it that way because I've actually said about myself that I have anticipatory anxiety
right
at times, where I'm just spinning out on what could happen. And then you're right. I think that when you're in it, you just do what's right in front of you. You handle what needs handling in a sense. That's fascinating. I love that interpretation. Yeah. Okay, so you have an incredible story and your book, The Family Gene, covers it more fully. But I'd love for you just to start us off, for those who are new to your story and your work, by telling the listeners a bit about your story, whatever pieces you feel comfortable sharing here.
Sure. So basically, I have this experience where I was in a writing group and a friend of mine in the group asked me how my father had died. He had died at that time, it was 10 years earlier. And I said, oh, he died of this gene, but we don't really know. We don't really have all the answers. And she was like, okay, that's fascinating. And I remember having this moment of being really? That's fascinating. So I started to sort of think about what she'd said over the next couple of, I guess, weeks or days or months. And I started to think, the fact is, if I were to start to think about telling my story, I would have to find out all the answers that I didn't have, that what answers we already had or what answers were coming or, anything. I'd have to start to look at it, to face it. So I decided to do that. And I began doing research into what had killed my father, this rare disease. And I knew at that time that I also was a carrier of the disease. So just to briefly tell you about that, when I was about 19 or 20, my father began to die of a lymphatic leak. So his body began to fill with this fluid called chyle, which is made up of lymph and emulsified fats. And if you're not digesting, your proteins and your fats, you're slowly starving. So my father was leaking this fluid and slowly starving to death. In 1996, which, 21 years ago, he finally died of this disease. And the time that he died, we knew very little. All we knew was my great aunt had come to the hospital and clutching this medical chart that was for her husband, who had died in 1961. He had spent 10 months in the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, where they had studied him and really looked at his case and tried to figure out what was going on with him. And when you read his chart, you were like, oh my God, it's identical to whatever's killing my father. So we knew that there was something happening that seemed to be genetic. We also at that point started to look at my father's grandmother, who was this man who died in the 60s, his mother, had also had swelling and a very slow, slightly different type of illness, but very similar in terms of having the lymphatic leak. And in her, it caused more breathing problems. It was in her lungs, so she was having trouble breathing.
Got
So it
it.
was slightly different manifestation, but similar. So all those things kind of led us to this team of medical geneticists at Harvard. Their lab is called the Seidman Lab, and Cricket Seidman was the geneticist who sort of led our case. And over time, they have been able to really figure out what's been going on with that particular condition, what is causing it. Also, she figured out, because of the way she saw it developing in my great grandmother and then how it was developed in my father and her son, my great uncle, she decided that it was probably X-linked, which means it's on the X chromosome. So I'm just going to do a very brief genetics lesson, but women inherit an X from their fathers and men inherit a Y from their fathers. And that's sort of what makes you male or female. And so obviously my sister and I had inherited this X chromosome from our father, and we then were carriers of this gene and were probably doomed to develop something at least similar to our great grandmother. So
Okay. So,
that's my
whoa.
story. Yeah, that's where we are.
Okay. So for those of you who are listening and you've not heard this story before, it's incredible. And Joselin tells it really beautifully also in her TEDx talk, which I will link to in the show notes. For sure, listen to it. It had me crying. So this all started in a writing workshop. You were already a writer. You'd written a couple of books before, correct?
That's right. Yep.
And then somebody said, well, tell me about your father's early death. And that spurred in you kind of a investigative process into your family history.
Yeah, I think it occurred to me that there was like this, I think there were two things that came into play, because I'm not a great memoirist. I mean, I don't love memoir, and I like people's stories, but I don't necessarily want to sit down and read your book about your your painful breakup, or I would love to do that over a glass of wine. It's just like not my book.
Right. Got it. So totally.
I just wasn't that girl. And so I think I started to think about genetics. That was like the first thing that really kind of hooked me, was that I started to realize how much we know right now in terms of genetics and DNA, and also how much is changing because of what we know. And I think it suddenly occurred to me that we all need to be talking at least a little bit about genetics and DNA. Like we all need like a cursory understanding of what these things mean. I think, you have things like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, and we can talk all about that stuff, but it's super problematic because none of us have thought like what's happening to our data, right? Like we're giving away our DNA to these companies kind of without really considering what that means. Like none of us really even knows like what is our DNA? Like what does that mean? And what's the value of that? So when you're spending $100 to have your DNA tested by these boutique companies, you are 100% giving away your DNA. Like you are 100% no longer owning your DNA. So that's like
right.
The first thing. Like there's tons of other things that are going on like that. You have also obviously the wonderful ways that understanding our DNA is helping us in terms of medicine and rare disease, but also common disease. Like we're actually able now to look at, in psychotherapy and the psychiatry, they're now actually gene mapping patients to more easily treat you, right? So if we sort of know about your genome and we understand a little bit better what medications have helped people with a similar genome, with certain types of mental illness, instead of like going through these things where you'd sort of try a drug for 6 weeks, 6 months, whatever they are, like some of them have these really long trial periods, you kind of realize like, okay, what's interesting is like with the genome map, they're able to better treat you. So like things like that are happening, which are also amazing. But I also think important that we understand what that means if we're going to be one of the people getting involved with that. And then there's also the small or large fact that I think any minute they will be handing us our babies and their genomes. So this is also like, we're right on that forefront. So there's a ton of reasons to understand a little bit about DNA. So suddenly I thought, I read this book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks.
Oh, I was just going to ask. I watched, well, it's now a show with Oprah Winfrey, and it was incredible. She was incredible in it. It was deeply fascinating. There's so many ethical undertones to it. Wow. Yeah,
that story, I liked the TV show, but what I loved about the book was the writer, Rebecca Skloot, did this beautiful job of weaving the science with this narrative. So you kind of got this like really interesting story of this family and this reporter who's trying to track down this family and tell their story. And then you
Mm-hmm.
had this incredible story of the science, which I don't think they did quite as well in the TV show. Like they really go back and like you're there when this doctor for the first time immortalizes cells and you learn about the science of that. And so I think when I read that book, I was like, okay, that's what I want to do. And I don't know, I don't think I did it. I don't know. I think I did it okay. I didn't do it, maybe not
Well,
as well as her.
everybody
But
critiques we're always our worst critics. So let's let them decide for themselves.
yeah,
I'm going to say it's
nothing. Yeah, no, I do feel like very much like that was like with my book, like I give you this family narrative, which is our story, and then the arc of sort of the history of medical genetics. I wanted it to loop even more together, but it doesn't. But I think it does really tell those two stories in a way that's really, I think, effective. Like if you want to know the basics of genetics, how we got to where we are, and in a way that's like, for me, like entertaining. Because I'm not a girl who's like, let's talk about base pairs. I'm like a girl who's like, can we name the base pairs Brangelina and Beyonce and
right.
like make it like not lame? I was like, let's describe DNA as a Twizzler. Like these were, and like, but that for me was like a really important piece of it. Like I didn't want to just like throw science at you. I wanted you to understand it and also enjoy understanding it,
Yeah.
to, as much as possible. So,
Well, I think the intention really is, and I love that. And I love that Oprah made this film too. I always believe that books are better than movies. Like when you translate one, you know what I mean? I just didn't happen to read this book, but in my experience, books tell a fuller story than the movie ever can. But what I love about the fact that they did it is that they've made it accessible. And that's what your story is aiming to do as well. Because my understanding is you're not a geneticist by nature, right? That's not your background.
right. Right. Yeah. I was like a mediocre science student. So I was like, how can I explain the science to me and understand it? So I had a lot of amazing experts who were they were like my gurus. And, I would come to them with a concept I had read and I'd be like, I don't get it. And they would explain it back to me in language that I understood. And then I would try to then relay it in a way that like I found entertaining. So I think that was the goal of the book. And that's, where I was going. So I think that for me was the first entree was like, we need to all be talking about genetics, or at least understanding at a very basic level what the hell's going on with our genes and DNA and data sharing and all these things. But in a totally entertaining way. Like, I swear it's not like dry science.
Right. Well, exactly. So when I told my husband's a science teacher, and when I told him I was interviewing you and I read him a bit about your book, he was like, oh my gosh, that's so fascinating, and he was going to ask me these questions that I had no, I'm like, dude, I don't know. I'll find out what I can find out when I talk to her. Okay. But I'm curious about the story, right? Because what I think you've done is couch some really important, relevant, current science in a story that is super provocative and quite tender. I mean, in the trailer for the book, it really says that you've been called a ticking time bomb. And you say that this gene is currently killing your sister and killing you. I mean, it really it stopped my breath short when I was watching it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering also if you can speak to, it's quite personal. This is really quite personal. And you've chosen to tell it through your book and an upcoming TV show, which we can talk about later, really publicly. And I'm wondering how that feels so far to have this story that, while you're fascinated by the genetics and it's incredibly relevant and important, it's really housed inside of your body and your life. And how is it to have that in the world?
Yeah, it's such a big question. And I feel like it's, I guess I don't at all want to minimize my situation. Like what my sister and I are dealing with is really harrowing, and a lot of days is like terrifying and horrible. On the sort of like the good news side of that is that we both feel pretty good. Like we don't have too many symptoms that are impacting our lives. And I think when you look at a lot of people with illness, or especially genetic disease, it can actually be life destroying. Like if you physically are unwell,
Right.
You can't get up, or you're a parent of a child who is so sick that every day is like just keeping that child alive is like your full-time job. But then maybe you also have a full-time job, and also
Right.
You're trying to solve the problem. Like I can't even imagine those scenarios. Like I feel like in my life, when I sort of think about my situation, I almost feel like I'm compelled to try to solve the case as much for, myself and my sister and my cousins as I am for like sort of like the possibility of humanity. Like the more of us that are like kind of like going, hey, you got to help us, and the government has to help, and insurance has to help, and big pharma has to help, everyone has to help. And I'm like, the more I can do to sort of create that path or walk that path so other people can just more easily get on the path, It's like almost like I have to, And it is also, I do feel incredibly compelled by having people I love, like my sister also with this gene, and myself and other family members, and certainly for the legacy of my father. So I think that all those things are true. That's like sort of the robotic way to talk about it. But, personally, I think that, when I think about like life, when I think about my life, and my sister and I have talked about this, it's like, I think if we do live to be, into old age relatively healthily, I think we, in a way, are very lucky because we've been able to sort of look at life in this other way, like where we're constantly sort of like the threat of death sort of looms. And I think that what I feel like I say to people, and it seems to shock them, is that that's all of us. Like, it's weirdly all of us. Like,
right.
And I think also we're kind of coming to this place, especially with our genome maps, where now like some of these boutique companies can actually send you, some health information. So you might get your little circle that tells you what percentage Neanderthal you are. And then also, and you're like, you have a 10% chance of getting Alzheimer's or 60% chance of getting Alzheimer's. And then, and I was talking to a geneticist, I believe, and he was telling me that the thought is that we will all have 3 markers in our DNA that will indicate how we'll die. So it's like, I do think like, as we sort of learn these things, what do we do with that information? What is, so for me, like I had a grandmother who had our gene, who lived to be 92 years old, who was relatively healthy her whole life. So I have these models that lived long, healthy lives. We don't know the extent of the damage in her body because she wasn't ever sick enough to like require a ton of exploratory surgery. So we don't know if she had the gene, if it was expressing in the same way as it does with my sister and I. The thing about the X chromosome is women have 2 of them. So we have this additional information that our bodies can refer to. And in our case, what they're thinking is some people have more of this bad information than others. So that's maybe why my grandmother lived longer. It's also possible just that my body will find a way to, become sort of, they're called vascular aneurysms. So I have these delicate pathways running through my digestive tract. It is possible that my body will find a stasis, like a way to sort of like the blood will continue to flow and it will be fine. And I can live my whole life like that, and be quite healthy. And I have to obviously be careful with certain things. But so it's like, it's sort of this marriage of like, and I say this for everybody, like if we all sit there and think about how we're going to die at every given moment, like we won't get out of bed. But if we sort of accept that this is a truth, we can sort of think, eat better, do more exercise, be like, try to like live a happier, like more satisfying life, and really like, use kind of our imminent death, like all of our imminent death to sort of live better and, live as long as we can, given what we have to work with. So.
Wow. You just said so many beautiful things. I mean, you probably don't even realize how much just came out of your brilliant mouth. So I just want to break it down for people a little bit. One thing that you said that I love so much is that, you're sort of living with a constant threat of death looming, but the irony is everyone is. And we don't really get that on a visceral level, most of us, right? So different from you, but when I was 23, I had cancer and it did give me this, it was terrifying. And it, I don't wish it upon anyone, but it did give me a gift that I think you're sort of speaking to, which is actual viscerally in my body. I'm very clear that I am mortal. I'm very clear that the thing I fear most, which is dying for me, is actually the only thing I cannot control, right? Like that is one thing every human planet over shares in common. Like that is a finality, at least in most people's belief system, right? And I love so much this idea that we could use our imminent death to live happier, healthier lives. That is huge. So that was one piece that I wanted to, let me just jam on that for a second more. So, because I have other pieces, but what does that look like for you? I mean, like, how do you choose to live your life in a way that doesn't have you crippled by fear, right? Because like you said, I don't know that I want to know what my genetics are in terms of here's the 3 different ways that could kill me. I think I might get really anxious about that. I'm not sure. How do you yourself walking in your day balance that looming fear with using it or leveraging it for a healthier and happier life?
It's a hard question because I think that, I was 21-ish when I realized that I had this gene. I don't think I understood what sort of possible, like, I didn't really realize that I was going to die from it or that I could get very sick from it at that point, I was told more I would live like my grandmother, who was living, quite well and was quite old. But I also think that I've had a lot longer. I've had years to sort of sit with it and consider it and think about it. And I think having done that, like I actually have said this to my sister who's raising kids and my friends who are raising kids, that, I actually think opening up the conversation about death when these kids are young makes it less scary. And I don't mean to be like, shove like heaven down, like life continues. Like, I don't know, maybe a little bit. Like, obviously, I wouldn't just be like death is an ending. And because I guess I don't think that it is. And having experienced death, I think a lot of people, I think the reason these stories about heaven have really like, and ghosts and everything, just life continuing, is that we realize, I think, when you lost somebody, that it doesn't feel quite as like definitively an ending as people say. This is like my big thought about mortality. Like, I think we have, as a culture, a sort of a Western culture, decided that birth is good and death is bad. There's like this total like onus on death that's like darkness, and birth is like lightness. But I actually think that they're both too big to contain like that. Like, I don't know anybody that has had a child and been like, I am 100% in a state of ultimately euphoria and everything is great. Like,
Nope.
It's like really complicated, right? Like, and I didn't do it, but I mean, obviously, like, it's a super complicated reality. Like, suddenly everything is different. There's a whole life here that exists. And that is going to come complete with like all the beauty and tragedy of living. Like, that's going to have everything. And I actually think the same thing is 100% true of dying. I think that there is a hugely tragic component because you suddenly don't get to experience that person in the way that you always have. But I think that, let's say, just for the sake of conversation, say that nothing comes after death. I think as a living person, the relationship evolves and you suddenly have a new relationship with that person if you allow yourself to have that. And if something does happen beyond death, which I think it does, I think that as this like new existence happens, you sort of experience the world in a whole new way. So I do not approach death like I am entering the scariest void, horrible thing ever. But I don't know if that's taken me years of sort of like grappling with death to arrive here. But I feel so 100% certain that it isn't just this like scary, awful thing that happens to all of us. I think it's much bigger than that. And I think that it also envelops almost as much beauty and wonder as it does horror and tragedy. So I guess that's kind of the best way to answer your question.
Wow, we got to go more on this. Okay. So, well, because I want to get there. And I know that people who are listening, everybody, for the most part, at the age bracket of the folks listening to this, has experienced loss and death in some way, right? Mm-hmm. And I really feel you on this idea that the Western message is birth good, death bad. I also think we haven't done as good of a job of nurturing rituals of passing, of knowing how to be with grief, those who are left behind and grieving afterwards. I don't think we do a great job of that. And I just think that you have found a way to some solace that others would really seek. So I want to like maybe go back to with your dad getting sick. And when I was watching your TED Talk, I totally started crying, partially because my dad died, what is it, like 6.5 years ago? I was around 2021, right? I was 33 when my dad died, and it was pretty quick. It was 5 months, and they didn't know what was wrong with him. They eventually did. We eventually learned that he had this very rare kind of cancer that was manifesting in his spine. But it was like, I can't even remember the statistics, interestingly, that I've blocked them out, but like less than 1% ever. And, maybe a few dozen cases or something like that, maybe 100 or fewer cases that they'd studied of this glioblastoma multiforme in the spine. And I remember in your talk, you said something beautiful that was like, or that resonated for me, that was kind of like, oh, you want to be average when it comes to an illness. You want to be something that people have studied before and understand. And when you start getting messages like, we just don't know what's going on, and infectious disease specialists are coming in our case, and, it really landed for me. I was like, oh, yeah, that was scary. It was scary to have unknowns. Maybe that's what I'm getting at, in the death process or in the illness process that led to death. And I just think it's so beautiful that you've actually, through living it, both with your dad's death and with you carrying this gene, have somehow gotten to hold the space for death and dying that's complicated and possibly more beautiful than most in the West see it as. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about when you really first remember your dad getting sick and kind of how that experience and subsequent experiences have led you to a more peaceful, it sounds to me like a more peaceful relationship to death and dying.
I think that like you're 100% right. I'm so sorry that that's how you lost your dad. Like I think that whole like the medical mystery thing is like amazing for an episode of House, but it so sucks when it's your life,
totally.
like I just think
Perfectly
it's
said.
like,
Yeah.
So I think, for us, like my mother wrote this amazing essay after my father passed away, and the title was The Loneliness of a Rare Disease. And I think there is this like isolation you feel. I remember when my father was sick, I was in college. So I was, 18 to, 21 basically. And my friends would be like, so what's wrong with your dad? And the answer was consistently, I don't know. And then you'd kind of start to explain it. But again, like our condition was lymphatic linked and nobody really knows about the lymphatics. Like that's a system that just doesn't come up that often. And literally like medicine doesn't know that much about the lymphatics.
Right.
We know that like they're fenestrated. So that means they have lots of holes, which is why if you get cancer and it gets into your lymph nodes, you don't want it there because your lymphatic system has so many, basically like it's sucking up toxins in your body. So it has to have lots of holes and lots of openings to suck that up. But then it can also release things where you don't want it
all
to,
over
right?
the place, like a spider web.
All over the place. Exactly. So that's sort of what we know about the lymphatics. It's just really like limited amount of information. So here I am, like, not only I don't have an answer when you ask me what's wrong, but I can't even really explain what's happening. And, there wasn't like, people would be like, well, is he dying? And then like, literally you're like, I don't know. And I remember, my mother actually said this to me. My father had been a physician in his life, and he used to say to his patients, at least it's something we've seen before. At least this is something somebody has survived, right? So the idea being that like there was hope, like
yes,
almost
exactly. That's what you spoke to that I was like, oh yeah.
Yeah. Like there would be this like prognosis that at least, somebody survived it, even if it was just like a period of time, like there was somebody has survived this thing.
Yeah.
And so that for my father felt like a really important thing to say to patients with like a scary diagnosis or a scary prognosis. So in my father's case, nobody had that. They didn't have any information for him to really like soothe him at all. And I think maybe in the back of his mind, he was actually a teenager when his uncle who had died of the same thing. So he knew about that story. I would guess, and obviously can't ask him, but I think he knew on some level that he was sharing symptoms with this guy who had died mysteriously in the 60s. And I think, that to him was terrifying because the end of that road was death for that guy.
Right.
And there wasn't anybody who'd had any sort of like good prognosis or way out. So for him, it became just a total fight for survival. And then, once he knew that it was genetic, it became a fight for survival and for the survival of his children. So I think there were a lot of things, motivating him. And so again, this kind of takes us back to this idea of like fear and worst case scenarios. Like I honestly can't imagine a scenario like more sort of like effed up than what my dad went through and what we witnessed him going through. I think everything about it, I know I keep tangenting, but I used to have these dreams when he was sick that I was in a plane crash. I was sitting, when the plane crash was over, I was like sitting on the runway and the plane had like disintegrated. I didn't have any marks. Like I was totally fine and I could walk away, but I was so traumatized by the plane crash. Like it was so obvious. Like what, the metaphor was like ridiculous. It was like, wouldn't even work in a book, but it's like, it really like that was kind of where I was mentally. It was like, I can't explain to anybody what's happening. And I used to, I remember sometimes telling lies to friends like, oh, like some guy was chasing me down the street and it really like, I remember like it was a lot of attention seeking things what were going on with me, but it was like for the sake of like, almost like I'm in such pain and I can't say to you, like, this is why, like my dad's dying or,
or he's so sick and we don't even know if he's dying, but it seems like he might be dying, right? It's so confusing. And honestly, 2018, 1920, that's young to process and understand these things, right?
And you don't have friends that have gone through it a lot of the time. So I remember for me, and this is something I recommend to people every time they lose somebody or go through these traumas, is seek out. I mean, I'm such a fan of like, like, I don't even know how to put it. Like, I'm such a fan of like groups. Like, I love that you can join a club and like be a member of a club with people that are like you, so you can go to support groups for grief, or you can go to, illness, you can join online these groups of people that are struggling with cancers or whatever, your children's illness. And I say join them all, or join as many as you can, or just join one, because I think sometimes having those voices to sort of help you get through it is incredibly helpful. And for me, I think, right after my dad died, a friend of mine said, my boyfriend's mom died when he was in high school. Do you want to talk to him? And I was like, like, it was like water. Like,
yeah, it's like a lifeline. Yeah.
So I just remember like this guy talked to me for like an hour. It wasn't even like, that long, but we talked for like an hour. And I was like, it was literally life changing just having that conversation. So I think that those types of things are really important. And that's also what's missing from a rare disease is you don't have that language. I know that in the years sort of since my father passed away, the rumor among his colleagues and his patients was that he had AIDS, because there was a lot of secretiveness around AIDS at the time, still in the 90s.
Yeah.
So I think people thought we were lying, which is also like a frustration. It's like, for me, writing this book became as much about telling our story and getting resources if we can, as like redeeming our family from like this, because it's a 1 in a billion. It's very rare to have a disease that is unnamed at this, in this day and age. And, so how do you sort of go, well, we won that shitty lottery. Like that's our lottery that we won. So,
oh my gosh. Right. No, and as a young person, rumors, it's so painful. You know what I mean? To have people doubt or speculate that you're even telling the truth. I can't even imagine what that did to the psyche on top of just processing his illness and his subsequent death, So a couple things there. I love this idea of building community and getting community support. I feel like I just want to ping on that because I have also found that to be in lots of walks of life, just super, super critical that people reach out. And it's actually been something that I've been able to do for people just like that guy did for you. Just random people have been like, oh, somebody in my life is, in their 20s and has cancer or has Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is what I had. And I've gotten on the phone with probably 3 or 4 people that I don't really know over the last 15, 20 years to 15 years. Yeah. To have those conversations, to just make it like have a touch of normalcy in somebody's experience. And so I just want to say that I think it's awesome you took her up on that, because some people just really isolate. And so you reached out to somebody. And then I want to just...
Yeah. I just want to speak to that, because I think I was in a situation where everything felt like nobody could relate. But when he died, I suddenly had something that people could relate to. So I was kind of starved for just any kind of like having somebody talk to me about it. Because I think but I think most of us, when we're in crisis, have a name for it. And it doesn't always make it necessarily easier to have people that you can relate to. And sometimes what they're going through is different than what you're going through, or they're handling it differently. I know, grief can often manifest. I know my sister and I grieve very differently. Like she becomes very emotional and sad. And sometimes it like bugs me that she's so emotional and sad, and then on the other hand, I think my sort of stoic, pragmaticism drives her crazy. So, I have noticed like we can't really grieve together, like that's not something we do well together. So I think part of this is also allowing yourself to say, okay, that's the wrong group. Like, okay, I put my toe in that group and that's a terrible group for me, and just get out. Like, because I think also in the 90s, we didn't have the internet like we have it now. We didn't have Facebook. We didn't have really obvious ways to connect to people, even sort of anonymously, like even with your own, like you can make up a profile and try it that way if it feels safer for you, or whatever you need. But I just think, and even if the crisis isn't a crisis like a death or an illness, maybe it's like, I don't know,
infertility,
your kids driving infertility, or your kids driving you crazy disease, or like whatever the thing is that's like, you're like, wow, like I feel so alone in this. I need to find somebody to talk to about this that can understand it. Like, I just think absolutely try, but also just like be ready to pull back if you need to. Cause I think that's also, it's not just about crashing in. It's like also about letting yourself get out.
100%. It's about finding a community that's the right fit for you. In my work, I work on relationships and communication. Part of that is, all of it is about cultivating honest and real and naked, communication strategies for real and honest relationships. Because I think it can be extra painful to want to be seen and heard by somebody who just isn't able to see and hear you. It can do you more damage in a sense. It's so important just to find people who are like ready to go there with you and ready to be where you're at in a way that feels good. I guess that's the bottom line. Like if you're struggling with something that's painful or traumatic, like a rare disease in isolation or death and dying in general, like you want to feel supported. You don't want any additional stressors in those relationships and in those conversations. You want to feel supported. So I love that. Just go looking for support and pull back if it doesn't feel like the right support at that time. It might be the right support later, but at that time.
Yeah. And I think anytime we're sort of like going, it's like, and this is like a really important thing to say. A lot of times with illness, if it's yours or your child's or somebody you care about's illness, it's very paralyzing. Like it's really hard to do anything. So I think those baby steps of like, okay, today I'm actually like making the steps super baby. Like this is like true of like working out. Like I remember I once was trying to develop an exercise book, which is crazy because I'm not a workout girl, but like this friend of mine was like, I want to use games to like inspire people to lose weight. We should write a book. So we were kind of trying to do this. And the idea was like, if you say like, I want to get to the top of Everest, like that's a really hard goal. Like you're not going to get to that goal just saying, I want to get to the top of Everest. But if you say, I want to read an article about somebody who got to the top of Everest, like that's an achievable goal. You can accomplish that goal in 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. Like you can sit down, Google, read an article. Like that's achievable. So I think when you're looking at something really difficult to attain, like, I don't know, you want help for your sick child, or you just want to get through your day, or whatever your thing is, being able to say, okay, today I'm just going to Google groups. I'm not even going to join. I'm just going to Google them. Like
breaking it down. Yeah.
Breaking it down and then joining the group and then talking to one person and then shutting in a computer and walking away, like just keeping it really small, attainable goals. Because I think that if you start to try to scale the mountain of this illness or this rare disease or finding a group or any of these things, like it's just really hard. But if you kind of break it down to the total, like one teeny tiny step at a time, you're going to get there. And it's going to take you a minute, but you're going to get there and you will start to feel like you're in a community and you're in a group. And so that's my 2 cents on how to do that.
Yeah, I love that because it's big. You're right. It's really, really big. What you dealt with your dad and what you've continued to deal with for 20 years, it's huge. And every day, I imagine you can't wake up and be like, okay, how am I going to solve today? I'm going to solve, genetic illness and the informational access to it. Like, no, you took steps. You started researching, you started writing, you started sharing. It was a process to get you even to this place where you can speak so eloquently about genetics and how it's impacted your family. I want to go back to something. I think we got on a tangent. And then if one of the listeners is like, wait a second, hold on. I want to loop back to death. Mm-hmm. Just because I feel like it's actually an easy topic to skip over. And I'm trying to get better about that, of really giving people the harder things to chew on. And I really still feel like you have a beautiful perspective on not fearing death the way many, many people do. And I just wondered if you could just speak a little bit more to that and how you came to have a greater sense of peace around it.
I remember, I don't have all the answers.
Of course, right.
But here's what I'll say. Like I, one time was on an airplane and it started to like get really super turbulent and I was freaking out. I was like, oh my God, like this is it. I'm going to die. The plane's going down. And I had like a million things that I needed to do before this plane went down. Like I was like, I cannot handle this right now. And like literally, like I was like, there's very important things that like have to happen before I can die. So this was when I was probably like 23 or something like that. And I think that I took this lesson from that. Like, and then maybe it was because my dad had just died and I knew that I had this gene at this point and this was all like becoming very real for me. But I made this decision when the plane stabilized and the panic attack, settled, that I needed to do the things that I needed to do. I needed to get them done. And then I needed to keep getting them done. So when people talk about bucket lists, which I think are like adorable, I kind of like roll my eyes. Like, I'm like, whatever bucket list, like do your bucket, like, okay, whatever, just don't make it a bucket list. Like actually just do the things. And I'm not talking about like, obviously like it would be awesome to like, I don't know, climb Everest as long as we're talking, or it'd be awesome to do a bunch, I don't know.
The Bali retreat or those kinds of bucket lists, like the dream. Yeah.
Totally, yeah. Like that'd be super fun, but I'm not like, I don't need it. Like on my deathbed, I'm not going to be like, oh, I wish I had like, sure. Like that would have been super cool. Hopefully like in my dead body state, I can like scan the globe and like do some deep sea dive. I mean, who knows? Like maybe my ghost self can like accomplish some of this stuff that it's a shame. But like, I think that for the most part, like being really real about the things that you need to do. So like if it's like about finding love or like about having a child or, accomplishing some goal that like will make you feel like you've left a mark or, whatever the thing is, like actually just start doing it. Like don't wait anymore. And because I think that weirdly, once you kind of have the peace that you've done what you need to do, and sometimes it's really little things. Like sometimes it is literally like I need to go on this vacation or I need to take more time with my kids or before bed at night, I need to hug my husband or, I don't know, whatever, like or I need to call my friends who aren't doing, like I have a thing like when I hear that a friend of mine is like having something bad going on, my brain is like a sieve and like I can't remember anything, but I'll put it in my like calendar reminder, like in a couple of days to circle back and check on them. Like even just like a text or a phone call or something just to see how they're doing. Yeah. Like, but I've noticed like having started doing that, I have more friends that do that with me too. So like our relationships have become more deep. Like I have these incredible relationships now that I feel like that have kind of come to pass because I've started to think more like I want them to. Like it matters more to me to have a meaningful relationship with this person than to like play another game of computer solitaire or I don't know, watch another or like even while I'm watching the show, I can check in with somebody, like things like that. I don't know, things like that just kind of add meaning to my life. Like I recently spoke in front of a class and my mom was there with her caregiver. My mom has cancer, so another death, but is looming. But yeah,
so sorry. Yeah.
So she was and somebody in the class asked about what I do to like sort of like live my best life or whatever. And the caregiver started to name all these things that I had, was doing with my life and how amazing my life was. And I was like, it was so cool to hear her say it. Like, it's weird to like say all the things that I feel like have made my life incredible, but I do feel like I have this incredible life. Will I like miss it? Like, yeah, like I don't want to die, but I know that I will eventually die. And today, right now, like I'm okay. Like
Yes.
There's a scene in the book where I thought that something had burst and I freaked out and it's a panic attack. In the book, it actually, I'll just give you the spoiler, but like it turns out it was a panic attack. But at the moment, I really thought everything was over. And I'm contemplating my death in the scene of the book. And I'm starting to realize that like everything, except for like this thing with the yams, I wanted to give my dogs yams. Like everything else, I felt like I had it all like organized. Like it was all organized. Like I knew, like everything was taken care of. My husband knew what to take care of. The people in my life knew, that I loved them. Like I felt like, wow, like there's nobody I need to make peace with. There's nobody I have to like, there's no big thing that I have to solve before I go. Like, and it was
amazing.
It was such a weird moment, but I think about it now, like, wow, like I think that that's partially why I live in peace. That's my mantra too, is like when I do start to freak out or have a panic attack, which, because it isn't to say that like my life is free of like anxiety, like it's not, but when I start to feel anxious, I'll sort of say to myself out loud, like, I want to live in peace and I want to die in peace. And like, I just say it and I say it with like a confidence and it calms me down every time. And, I go back to this idea that like everything is worse than the anticipation. So if I can imagine like the worst death, I think it's okay. Like I don't know, like why? Like, first of all, why sit there and imagine the worst case scenario for death? But okay, like even if that were to pass, like, it would, I think it's going to be okay. Like, and I also love that Harry Potter line where Dumbledore's like, it's as quick as falling asleep. Like, I'm like, okay, I'll just remember that. It's as quick as falling asleep, so.
Yeah.
I think that it's a million things to say, but I think at the end of the day, it is really about finding a peace and really like just deciding like you're ready to find that peace. Like you're ready today. Just get everything to a place where it's going to be okay.
I love that so much. And I think everybody, no matter what, could learn from that, regardless if they're carrying a rare and deadly gene. Honestly, obviously that's 1 in a billion, but each of us right now, and I say this to my clients all the time, we're spending our time on things that aren't what really matter to us. Like we're spending our time and our energy on things that seem like they have to get done, but really aren't what we would ever be thinking about if we were on that plane and we thought it was going down, And so I just love this. The way I wrote it down was like living your real bucket list. Now, it's what I loved about what you said. It's just what would the idea that you could actually say, actually, all of my, not just my affairs are in order, but like my life is in order. People know I love them. I made a contribution and was of service in some way. Could you make more? Of course. If you continue to live for 40 more years, you're going to keep blowing up the information zone on genetic disease and how to help people and how to have access. You're going to keep doing good work.
Right.
But did you do something? Yeah, you did. Right. I think that's beautiful. And I guess I want to like pause for every listener to consider, what is your real bucket list? And what's, again, back to small actions, right? Like what's one small action you can take towards getting your real affairs in order, if for lack of a better way of saying it. I just think that that is what has you be able to approach the ticking time bomb diagnosis you've been given with more grace. It's amazing. Before we wrap up, I want to know how you're doing now, like how your health is doing now, and what you kind of see in layman terms for new technologies and genetics, like hope for the future for other people who might be listening, being like, oh my gosh, in my family we have this. And, because there are other rare genetic diseases out there, right, that are constantly being studied and researched. And I'm wondering how you're doing now and what you see as kind of what next steps for the future with it all.
So I think that, like, first of all, there's amazing things happening right now with genetics and research. And the biggest one, if you guys are interested in like looking anything up, is I would say CRISPR technology. It's CRISPR technology. And this is this gene editing you keep hearing about. Like now they can gene edit this and they can, gene therapies are advancing. And it's all basically through this technology called CRISPR. And yesterday there was actually an article in the LA Times about an even newer technology that doesn't even, so CRISPR basically is like a mugshot, and it sort of like uses your immune system. When you hear about immunotherapies and cancer, that's what they're talking about is CRISPR, using your immune system. Yeah.
Wait, time out. This is so timely. First of all, we're going to put these links in the show notes. Joselin, will you message me the article so we can get that in the show notes?
Yeah.
But I also just want to say that my next door neighbor, who is my beloved person in the world, is 15, and she has cancer, and she just spoke yesterday in Washington to a subcommittee of Congress on immunotherapy and cancer research for kids. And I just can't believe you're circling it back to that, because most people actually, I love that you say, you're always hearing about, well, a lot of people listening probably have never heard of a genome map or some of the things you're talking about. So I'll make sure that some of those resources are down below in case they're ready to go down the rabbit hole and really learn more. I think it's awesome. So go ahead.
Awesome. Yeah, I was going to say there's an amazing radio lab that talks about CRISPR that I think explains it in a way that's very accessible, really entertaining, and it will just kind of make you go, oh, like that's what they're talking about when they talk about all this stuff.
Oh, cool.
I'll give you that link as well, but that's an incredible show as well, or resource. Yeah, like I think, so those are some of the things that the new technology that's in the LA Times, basically they're describing it as like a pencil that erases a base pair and like actually changes the protein to behave like the other protein. So that,
Wow.
That's a whole crazy thing that they're doing. And what that one can potentially do is actually cure things like cystic fibrosis. So we're talking about actual cures for genetic disease, which we've never talked about. One of the things that sort of struck me as I was writing my book, and this is even, I was writing the book 2 years ago, so very recently, things like cystic fibrosis were still very much rudimentary treatments. Like we're getting better, like people with CF can live into their 30s now and occasionally a little bit older, but like, you're still like living a really rough life. And the treatments they have are pretty rudimentary. They're pretty they're not awesome at this point. And so, we're talking about the potential to cure things like that in a living person, which is like,
amazing.
I don't know, but that's also something to think about in terms of like, well, that's also, if we can do that with disease, we can do it with all kinds of things. So these are things to really keep an eye on. One of the things I always say is like, and this is why I keep going back to like, start to learn a little bit about this stuff, because either the pool of people making the decisions is going to be really, really tiny, or it's going to be super clueless, right? Like that, like it's going to be big and clueless. So I think more of us just need to understand what we're already learning and what we're doing, both in a good way and a bad way. There's an amazing situation in Iceland right now where Down syndrome has almost been completely weeded out because of basically not gene therapies, but because of gene screening, like genetic screenings for children. it's a questionable, I have questions
Right, of
about that. Like,
course.
do we want to weed out Downs? Like that
Some
there's some
parents of
amazing
Downs
people.
would say no. Yeah.
Right. There's huge questions, ethical questions with deafness that the deaf community would say, who's going to be the person to quote unquote cure the deafness in a baby? Like, should the baby decide as an adult? And this is actually something that I think recently they've approved this gene therapy for deafness. So I think we're just going to do it. We're just going to quote unquote cure deafness. But that's kind of a tragic reality when you think about this beautiful, thriving culture of deafness, which is a lot of deaf people do not consider a lack of hearing to be a deficit. They consider it an advantage. So these are just things to consider and think about. And I'm not arguing one way or another because I feel very torn about the whole thing. I think but at least I understand both sides of that argument and feel like I could weigh in an educated way. And I think that's something that we all should get better at because these are our realities today.
Right.
Things like CRISPR, we're already good at. It's cheap and we are already really good at it. So I think that those are things.
So let me just interrupt for 1 second because gosh, you say you live in this world, you swim in this water, right? So it seems so clear to you. But I think one of the things you're really saying that I want everybody to hear is part of your mission with your book, The Family Gene, and the work you're doing, the talks you're giving, is really about all of us wising up a little bit to what's actually going on around us with genetics, because it actually can have huge sweeping impacts, both on a personal level within our own family systems and larger level in our societies at large, right? And it's important for us to have some working knowledge so we can advocate for things that matter to us.
Right. And I think that it's super, super hopeful in terms of like, we are on the precipice of curing cancer because of genetic medicine.
Mm-hmm.
We're on the precipice of curing rare genetic disease and not so rare genetic disease because of what we know about our genes and our genomes. So we are like right there, and all those things are incredible, but it also does start to line up some ethical questions that are pretty major.
Yeah, of course.
And I'm very hopeful that we're going to all keep it. I hope that it doesn't limit our ability to cure and make things, heal people. But I also hope that at the same time, we're doing it with an eye toward, keeping our world diverse and keeping it beautiful and, those types of things as well.
Responsibly. I love that. Okay. So there's hope.
Yes.
And with hope, we have to really consider ethics, clearly.
Yes.
And how are you?
Yes.
Everybody's going to want to know. How are you doing? Everybody already loves you now who listens,
well.
so they want to know what's going on inside of your system.
My genome. Mm-hmm. Well, my sister and I are both doing really well right now. We have this amazing team that I mentioned earlier, and they're doing a lot to research us. Our problem is still like it was 5 years ago when I did the TED Talk, that we haven't been able to name the disease because we haven't been able to publish. And that's still our situation. But right now, they have colonies of mice. They have a ton of mice with our mutated gene. Some of them have started to show this like molecular level symptoms of our disease. So I believe they will be able to publish fairly soon, and they're working on it. So that's really hopeful for us. But as far as our health goes, like, we still have blockage in our livers, and I had a procedure that failed, which was really very disappointing. Yeah. But at the same time, I think that we're learning. We're also trying to figure out, like, did my procedure fail because I have a cousin that the procedure worked. It worked for her. So the question is, she also had her spleen removed. So is that something we need to consider, is like having our spleens removed? Anyway, so
got it.
We have lots of questions, but we're on it. We have a lot of amazing people working on our case. So, and with the sort of the book coming out and the TV show and all these cool things, like people are showing more interest, which is really helpful. Like one of the things that I've said like over and over is like, when you have a rare disease, it's always a battle for attention and resources. So by talking about it and writing the book, I'm definitely positioning us in a much better way than like a person who's like sitting at home, with their illness kind of going like, oh my gosh, like how do I even start? So yeah. I feel like in that way, we're really lucky and we're good.
It's amazing. So you're a living science experiment. You are literally a living science experiment. There are colonies of mice. They're trying to reproduce this illness inside of these mice so that they can publish research about it. And
exactly.
You are undergoing procedures and trying to see what will work and prolong your life. And I just want to commend you for being courageous enough to share this story with the world while you're actually in it. I mean, most people who are dealing with something that's so pressing in their own personal lives, it's hard for them to see beyond that. And I just want to commend you for being courageous, for being, as I like to call it, naked and really showing up and sharing your story. How can people get the book and where can they find out about this TV show?
Thanks. The book is The Family Gene, and you can get it anywhere. And a couple of months ago, when the book first came out, I get this phone call that like Jim Parsons from
Big Bang Theory
liked my book. And I was like, what? And so I had this awesome phone call with Jim. And
you could hardly even finish that sentence. I
know, so crazy. And his husband and a producer that they work with for their company, That's Wonderful. And it was like this amazing phone call where they were just like, very complimentary, had really enjoyed the book, and they wanted to develop it, into a TV show. So I had been thinking about that a little bit, and I had this idea that had actually come from another person, but that the show could be like a medical, like a Grey's Anatomy, because if you're going to like maintain like a TV show, like it has to have like a hook,
drama.
It has to. So I was like, it could be like a Grey's Anatomy if like the me character was a doctor and I still had a rare genetic disease, but I'm like also solving genetics cases. So they thought that sounded really great and they got excited about that. So then they, got the funding from, I think, Warner Brothers. And then with Warner Brothers and That's Wonderful, they went to all the networks, and Fox liked it and picked it up. So there's this amazing writer, this guy, Greg Spottiswoode, is writing or helping to develop the pilot or developing the pilot, I guess. And it's not like nothing is for sure. And everybody will tell you like I shouldn't even get this excited. But
yes,
like,
you should. You should get this excited.
Right? Thank you. Like it feels super, super fun. Like it's like thinking about, the story both as like a medical drama, but also kind of like with this like infusion of like, so he wants to put like the two sisters. So it's me and my sister are like the main characters, and we're both doctors, and we're both like, we're like in the race against the clock to like solve our own case, but also solve all these patients' cases. And I just think it's really cool. And I love the ideas this guy has. So it's been really fun.
Oh my gosh, Joselin.
Sorry.
Yes. First of all, don't let anybody tell you shouldn't be excited. It doesn't matter what happens with it. It's gotten this far. And I really feel like, my mission and vision and hope and dream and desire with my podcast, with this show, is that women can amplify their voices and really see themselves as like, wait, I can make that happen. Like that these are real women with real stories having a real impact. And the work you're already done sharing your story puts genetics at a hugely accessible, relatable scale. And so I love that you're modest, but I think it's a huge deal. And having written a book myself, it's hard to write a book. So A, you've written a few books. B, this one has been noticed and seen, and it's validated your story, and it's making others aware of what is happening in the world of genetics. It's huge. And so
thank you.
I really don't want you to downplay that. That's my end of the call coaching. Don't downplay that shit.
I love it. No, and I actually I have, like my friends who are still dating or, whatever, like my thing is always like, be excited, because it isn't like when you guys break up, like you'll be any less sad about it. Like, let yourself
feel it.
Enjoy. Yeah. So I'm trying to be like in the crush phase where I'm like, this is so cool. And like, it's going to end horribly. I'll just deal with it then.
Right. Well, it's like that expression, better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. Right. I mean, there's a reason these expressions become, right? And this is the possibility of television. I'll end with this idea, but the possibility of television is so much. There's book and then there's TV. All of these things just get a message out to the masses in a way that's really accessible to people. Not everybody's reading the LA Times or the New York Times. They're not,
Oh, I totally agree. And I think that being able to talk about some of these conditions in a forum like television, where you can like sort of present these stories that are super amazing, like people I know who've gone through these incredible things, and getting to dramatize that and put it on the TV and having people see it, then you're less alone.
You're less alone.
You really do feel less.
It's beautiful. It's you're like Shonda Rhimes, whom I love so much, and everybody should read The Year of Yes. But just the way that she's really, brought different diversity and actors and actresses and leaders of color into the mainstream, So it's this is how we do it. And it starts with a girl who's courageous enough to do it. So thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you so much. This was amazing. I really appreciate it.
You're so welcome. Maybe we'll have you back on when that show is up. Yeah. Woo.
Awesome. I'll totally do that. I'd love that.
Thanks, Joselin.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to Naked Conversations. Yay! It really means the world to me every time you show up. And if you want to know more about how to work with me personally and my coaching, you can check that out over at sagebhabs.com. You can also get some great free resources over there about how to make powerful requests, and many blog posts full of resources for living a naked life, as well as grab a copy of my book, Naked Communication, Courageously Create the Relationships You Really Want. And lastly, keep the conversation going with us over in the Facebook community, Sage B. Hobbs joselinlinder.com/Facebook, where we can keep talking about these super important and powerful topics of living a life fully expressed. Thanks again. See you next time.